Devonshire, September 1817. The meeting had been arranged by Lady Eva, which meant it had been arranged with the relentless practicality of a woman who believed every problem in the civilized world could be solved by putting the correct two people in the correct room and leaving them unsupervised. The Duke of Thornfield needed money. The Ashford family had more of it than most counties, and a daughter who understood where all of it was. Lady Eva had identified this convergence the way a cartographer identifies a river crossing, not with sentiment, but with geometry. She had written 3 letters, called in one favor, and arranged for Elowen Ashford to be presented to the Duke at Thornfield Manor on the 2nd Tuesday of September. She had not asked Elowen what she thought about any of this. She had asked Elowen's father, Harlan, who had said, "Ask my daughter." Lady Ivo had taken this as a quaint expression of paternal pride, rather than the precise operational instruction it was. Elowen arrived at Thornfield Manor in a carriage her father had purchased in London, and she had selected herself, because she selected most things herself. She wore a dress the color of deep amber, warm, deliberate, the kind of color that announced presence without requesting attention. She had reviewed Thornfield's accounts through 3 separate channels before agreeing to the meeting. 2 were legitimate. The 3rd was expensive and worth every shilling, because it had told her what the others had not. The estate was not merely struggling, it was drowning, methodically, in the way estates drowned when the man holding the title believed that legacy was a substitute for revenue. Her father walked beside her to the front entrance. He was a man who had built a shipping concern from a single warehouse in Bristol and had learned, across 30 years of negotiation, that the most important moment in any meeting was the one before the first word was spoken. He watched his daughter straighten her gloves as they approached the door, the small, precise gesture she performed before every significant encounter. And he knew, had known for years, watching this person become extraordinary, that the Duke of Thornfield was not prepared for what was about to walk into his drawing room. He was not wrong. The Duke appeared at 10:30. He entered from the east corridor with the stride of a man who moved through his own house the way weather moved through a valley, without consultation. He was younger than she had anticipated, and he carried himself with the specific stillness of someone who had learned authority not from achievement, but from architecture, from growing up inside walls that had been telling him who he was since before he could speak. He looked at her father first, then at Lady Iva, who had positioned herself by the fireplace with the practiced invisibility of a woman who wished to observe without the inconvenience of being observed. Then, and only then, at Elowen. The look lasted 2 seconds. She counted. "Mr. Ashford," he said to her father. "Your Grace," her father said, and then, with the economy of a man who had been instructed, gestured toward his daughter. "I believe the conversation is with Elowen." The Duke's expression did not change, which was itself a change. He looked at Elowen again, the same 2 seconds, the same inventory. "Perhaps we might sit," he said, to the room rather than to her. They were shown to the study. It was a room designed to communicate. Dark wood, deep chairs, a desk the size of a small country's ambitions. Elowen noted the books on the shelves, many of them legal, most of them untouched. She noted the estate map on the wall, large and prominently displayed, the way men displayed maps when they wanted you to understand the scale of what they controlled. She noted the single chair placed before the desk, as opposed to beside it. She had been assigned the position of a petitioner. She sat in it without comment, because she understood that correcting a man's furniture was less effective than correcting his assumptions, and the second required patience with the first. Her father took the chair by the window. Lady Ivach dissolved into the corner. The Duke sat behind the desk. He placed his hands flat on the surface, the physical declaration of a man establishing the terms of the space. "I will be direct," he said. "Please," she said. "Thornfield requires capital. The estate has obligations that are significant and time-sensitive. I have been advised that a strategic alliance with a family of substantial commercial resources would address the situation while preserving the estate's position and reputation." He paused. "I am prepared to discuss terms with your father." The room shifted. Not visibly, the furniture remained where it was, but something in the architecture of the conversation relocated itself, and everyone present felt it. "With my father," Elowen said. "The terms of any arrangement of this nature are a matter between heads of household," the Duke said, with the fluency of a man quoting something he believed to be self-evident. "I do not negotiate with women. It is not a question of preference. It is a question of proper order." Elowen looked at him. She looked at the desk between them, the estate map behind him, the books he had not read, and the hands placed flat on the surface as though the wood itself required governing. She understood, with the clarity she brought to balance, sheets, and shipping routes, and every room she had ever entered, that the Duke of Thornfield had not invited her here to meet her. He had invited her here to be presented, like a document requiring a signature that was not her own. She thought about what it cost a man to say those words to a woman whose family's accounts could rebuild his estate twice over. She concluded it was something older and more personal than ignorance or principle. The rigidity of a man who had been given something he did not earn, and had confused the having of it with the understanding of it. She removed her right glove. She did it slowly, deliberately, finger by finger, with the calm precision of someone performing a gesture she had considered carefully. She placed the glove on the desk between them, beside his flattened hands, and extended her bare hand across the surface. "Then perhaps," she said, "you might shake my hand, and we can discuss terms as equals, regardless of the order you prefer." He looked at her hand. He looked at it for 3 full seconds, which in the silence of that study, in the September light, with Lady Eva frozen by the fireplace and her father motionless by the window, was long enough to become a decision. He did not take it. "Miss Ashford," he said, and his voice had not changed in register, which made it worse. "The terms will be discussed with your father. That is how it is done." She held her hand steady for 1 more second, without tremor, without the faintest concession to the weight of what had just been refused. Then she withdrew it, picked up her glove from the desk, and put it back on with the same deliberate precision. She stood. "Thank you for your clarity, your grace," she said. Her voice was the temperature of the September morning outside, cool, bright, and entirely without cloud. She inclined her head, the precise degree that acknowledged his title without granting it authority over her departure, and turned toward the door. "Miss Ashford," he said behind her, and there was something in it now, not alarm precisely, but the tone of someone who had expected the scene to proceed in a direction it was no longer proceeding. She did not turn. "Father," she said from the doorway, and Harlan Ashford rose from the window chair with the unhurried movement of a man who had been waiting for exactly this, and followed his daughter through the entrance hall and into the Devonshire morning without a single word to the Duke of Thornfield. Lady Eva remained by the fireplace for 11 seconds after they left, which she later described as the longest 11 seconds of her adult life, before excusing herself with a murmur that contained, for those fluent in Lady Eva's murmurs, a comprehensive audit of her nephew's judgment. The carriage was moving before Elowen spoke. Her father, who had built a commercial empire on the understanding that silence after a failed negotiation was more valuable than commentary, waited. "He does not want a partner," Elowen said, looking at the Devonshire road unwinding ahead of them. "He wants a treasury with a bloodline attached to it, and he wants to negotiate for it with someone other than the person who controls it." Her father was quiet for a moment. "The estate is genuine trouble, Elowen. The man is not performing difficulty." "I know his difficulty is genuine," she said. "His contempt is also genuine. The two are not in competition." Her father looked out the window. The Thornfield chimneys were receding behind the tree line. "What will you do?" She was quiet for a long time. She thought about a hand extended across a desk and left hanging in a room designed to make her small. "Lord Dunmore," she said. Her father turned from the window. "His rival," he said. "His competitor," she corrected, "for the Harmouth Harbor contract. Dunmore has been positioning for it since spring. He has the connections, but not the capital. We have the capital and not the connections." Her father studied her. "Elowen, the Harmouth contract is the single largest commercial opportunity in Devonshire this decade. If you bring the Ashford capital to Dunmore's bid, Thornfield loses the contract entirely." "Yes," she said, "and the Duke will know exactly why." "Yes," she said again. She pulled her glove tight on her right hand, the one she had extended, the one he had refused, and looked at the road ahead. "He told me he does not negotiate with women. I intend to make that the most expensive sentence he has ever spoken." Her father looked at her for a long moment, and then looked back at the road and said nothing further, because he had spent 24 years watching this woman turn refusals into architecture, and he knew that the conversation was over, and the construction had begun. Caius Merivale, Earl of Dunmore, received her on a Thursday, 2 days after Thornfield. He was 31, unhurried in the way of a man who had learned that rushing was a confession of anxiety, and he had the quality of someone who listened before he calculated, the reverse of the usual order, and, in Elowen's experience, the mark of a genuinely dangerous negotiator. He met her in his study, which was smaller than Thornfield's and better used. The desk had documents on it. The bookshelves had gaps where volumes had been removed and not yet returned, which meant they were being read somewhere else in the house. There was one chair before the desk, and when she entered, he moved it beside the desk rather than across from it, without comment, as though the geometry of a conversation was something a reasonable person attended to. "Miss Ashford, your letter mentioned the Harmouth contract." "It did." "Your letter also mentioned that you have recently concluded a meeting at Thornfield Manor that did not proceed to your satisfaction." "It did not mention that," she said. "It implied it. There is a difference, and I appreciate that you noticed." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. The architecture of one, waiting for permission. "The Harmouth bid requires capital I do not have," he said. "You are offering that capital." "I'm offering a partnership," she said. "The capital is one component. The shipping infrastructure is another. The Ashford fleet operates 11 routes through the southern ports. Harmouth would be the 12th and the most profitable if the harbor improvements are executed correctly." "You want to negotiate the terms yourself," he said. "Not a question." "I want to negotiate the terms myself," she confirmed. He extended his hand across the desk. She looked at it. An open hand, offered without ceremony. The hand of a man who had not asked whether her father was available. She removed her right glove with the same deliberate precision she had performed at Thornfield, and took his hand with the bare grip of a woman completing a transaction she had initiated. "Welcome to the Harmouth bid, Miss Ashford," he said. She picked up her glove. She did not put it back on. She held it in her left hand for the remainder of the meeting, which lasted 2 hours and covered the harbor survey, the capital structure, the county permits, and exactly none of the things that would keep the Duke of Thornfield awake that evening when the news reached him, because Devonshire was a county that moved information the way its rivers moved water, downhill and to everyone. The Duke was informed by his steward, a man named Burrell, who had the gift of delivering consequential information in the voice of someone remarking on the weather. The Ashford family has entered the Harmouth bid, Your Grace, in partnership with Lord Dunmore, Miss Ashford, specifically. The capital contribution is considerable. The Duke set down the document he was holding, with the controlled precision of a man who was not going to allow his hands to communicate what his expression had already failed to conceal. The Harmouth bid, he said. Our bid. We remain in the competition, Your Grace, but the Dunmore position is now substantially stronger. The Duke was quiet. Burrell, who had served 3 generations of Thornfield Dukes and had developed an exquisite sensitivity to the varieties of ducal silence, recognized this one as the kind that preceded either a decision or a storm, and excused himself before discovering which. The county absorbed the news with attentive pleasure. The Ashford girl, and she was still the Ashford girl to families who had been in Devonshire since the Conquest and considered anyone arriving after 1600 to be essentially tourists, had thrown her family's fortune behind Dunmore's harbor bid, and everyone understood what that meant, even the people who pretended not to. Elowin spent the first 3 weeks of October proving that the Ashford capital was not a decoration attached to Dunmore's ambition, but the engine driving it. She reviewed the harbor survey with Dunmore's engineers and identified 2 errors in the silting projections that would have cost the project £1,100. She renegotiated the timber supply contract with a yard in Plymouth that had been overcharging Dunmore for 2 years. She checked every number, with the methodical attention of a woman who had been reading shipping ledgers since she was 14 and had never confused diligence with distrust. Dunmore introduced her to his solicitors as his partner, not his financier, and the distinction was heard by everyone who needed to hear it. She established herself at the Ashford House in Harmouth, turning the front study into an office that operated 6 days a week with a view of the harbor she intended to rebuild. The town noticed. Harmouth was a working town, and a woman who arrived with capital and stayed to deploy it personally was a different species from investors who sent letters and never visited. The Duke, during this period, did not call. He did not write. He continued his own Harmouth bid with resources considerable in name, but increasingly inadequate in capital, and the gap widened with each week in the specific, measurable way that gaps widen when one side has Ashford money and the other does not. He did, however, attend the Devonshire Autumn Assembly on the last Saturday of October, the same assembly Elowin attended on the arm of Lord Dunmore. The first time the Duke had seen her since she walked out of his study 5 weeks earlier, with the most expensive sentence he had ever spoken still hanging in the September air behind her. The assembly was held at Fenworth House, which belonged to the Caulfield family. Elowin arrived with Dunmore at 9. She wore a dress the color of dark wine, and she entered the room with a composure that came from understanding that the first 30 seconds determined everything that followed. She saw the Duke immediately. He was near the east windows in conversation, and he was in the middle of a sentence when she entered, and he finished it, which told her he had seen her and chosen to complete his thought rather than abandon it. 40 minutes into the evening, with the room settled into its patterns, the Duke appeared at the edge of her group. He arrived through a series of adjacent conversations that moved him across the room with the appearance of coincidence and the precision of intention. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Your Grace," she said. Dunmore, beside her, shifted his weight, the smallest redistribution of stance that communicated awareness without alarm. "Lord Dunmore," the Duke said, and the 2 words contained the entire history of their competition. "Thornfield," Dunmore said, with the ease of a man who had been saying that name across rooms for 15 years. The Duke looked at Elowin. This time the look was not 2 seconds. It was longer, and it was not the inventory from the study. Something behind it had rearranged itself in the 5 weeks since she had walked out of his house, and the new configuration was harder to read. "The harbor survey corrections," he said. "The silting projections. That was your work." It was not a question. He had done his accounting. "It was," she said. He nodded, acknowledging something he was not yet prepared to name, and moved on. Dunmore, beside her, was quiet for a moment. "He knew about the silting corrections," Dunmore said. "That is not public information. He would have had to review our filing with the Harbor Commission." Elowen looked across the room at the Duke, who was now in conversation, and was not looking at her, in the way that a man did not look at someone when he was acutely aware of exactly where they were. "He is paying attention," Dunmore said. "Yes," she said. "He is." The storm came on the 14th of November, and it did to the Harmouth Harbor Wall what 60 years of Atlantic weather had been threatening to do. 40 feet of the eastern breakwater collapsed into the channel. The timber staging for the new quay, Dunmore's staging, purchased with Ashford capital, was shattered into wreckage that the morning tide distributed across the harbor mouth with the indifferent efficiency of the sea. Elowen was at the Harmouth office by 6 the following morning. She was standing on the harbor wall reviewing the damage with Dunmore's chief engineer when the Duke of Thornfield arrived on horseback from the North Road with his own engineer, looking like someone who had received bad news at 4 in the morning and had been moving with purpose ever since. He looked at the breakwater, at the collapsed stone lying in the channel like the ruins of an argument the sea had finally won, with a focused attention different from the study, sharper, less performed. He understood stone and water and the physics of coastal engineering in the way of a man who had grown up on an estate, bordered by the sea, and had paid attention to it, the way she had paid attention to ledgers. "Your silting corrections," he said to her. "In the harbor survey, you identified the scouring pattern. If those corrections had been applied to the original breakwater design, this section would have been reinforced 3 years ago." She looked at him. He was standing in the rain on a ruined harbor wall at 6 in the morning, telling her she had been right, and the rain was flattening his hair, and his coat was practical rather than fashionable, and he was not performing anything at all. And she found this, against every resolution she had made since September, considerably more affecting than it had any right to be. The county commission required both bidding parties to conduct a joint damage assessment before any contract could proceed. She and the Duke spent 4 days on the harbor wall. 4 days of measurements and tide calculations and arguments about load-bearing capacities that were not entirely about load-bearing capacities. He was good at this. She had not expected him to be. She had expected him to be good at authority and delegation. But he thought about structures the way she thought about ledgers, from the ground up. And the discovery unsettled her in ways she was not prepared to account for. On the second day, he corrected her engineer's calculation of the tidal load on the western footing. And he was right. And she told him so. And something shifted between them that had nothing to do with the harbor, and everything to do with the intimacy of two people discovering that they thought about problems the same way. On the third day, a section of staging gave way beneath her feet. It was not dramatic, 8 inches, not 8 feet. But his hand was on her arm before the drop was complete, steadying her with a grip whose reflexes had answered a question his judgment was still formulating. They stood like that for 2 seconds on the broken staging with the tide below them, and then she said, "I'm fine." And he released her arm, and neither of them mentioned it for the rest of the day, and it cost them both considerably. On the 4th day, they submitted the co-signed assessment, her name beside his on the document, the first time those 2 names had appeared on the same piece of paper. She looked at it, Ashford and Thornfield, in ink on a county record, and thought about a man who had refused to negotiate with her, co-signing an engineering report with her. She suspected, from the way he had paused before signing, that the signature line had not escaped him either. Dunmore, during the 4 days of the assessment, had remained in Exeter on business he described as pressing, and she understood as deliberate. He was giving her the harbor, not because he could not manage it, but because he had recognized, with the strategic clarity that made him formidable, that Eloan on the harbor wall with the Duke of Thornfield was a development worth observing from a distance. She had not discussed this with him. She did not need to. Dunmore was a man who read situations the way other men read contracts, and his silences were as calculated as his statements. She set aside the thought of what his deliberate absence meant, and what it meant that she had noticed it, for a time when she could afford to examine it honestly, which was not now, because now there was a harbor to rebuild, and a man whose hand on her arm was occupying more of her attention than any 2-second grip had a right to occupy. The winter assembly at Fenworth House was in December, 3 weeks after the harbor assessment. Eloan attended with Dunmore. She wore deep winter blue. Lady Ivar found her within 10 minutes. The harbor assessment. I understand it was productive. It was thorough, Eloan said. The commission was satisfied. The commission is not the audience I am asking about. Eloan looked at her. Lady Ivar looked back, clearly not going to pretend that a co-signed engineering report between her nephew and the woman he had refused to negotiate with was not the most significant document produced in Devonshire since the county charter. He is competent, Eloan said carefully. He has always been competent. He has not always been willing to recognize competence in others. She paused. The fact that he co-signed your assessment rather than submitting his own is a revision I did not expect before spring. Eloan was formulating a response when she heard the voice from the group behind her. Male, carrying, calibrated, to reach exactly the right number of ears. One does wonder, Sir Marcus Welling was saying, about the precedent. He was speaking to 3 men and 2 women who had the expressions of people being offered something entertaining at someone else's expense. Sir Marcus was 57, baroneted, and in possession of the confidence that accumulated in men who had never been told they were wrong by anyone they considered worth listening to. A commercial house from Bristol, entering a county contract of this significance. On the arm of an earl, naturally, one must have the correct escort. But the question remains whether the Harmouth Harbor is best served by— He paused, and the pause was a weapon. By parties whose primary qualification is the ability to write a large number on a bank draft. The Harbor Commission, he continued, has operated for 80 years on the principle that county infrastructure is a matter for county families. Families with, another pause, established roots, not transplanted ones. Eloan turned. She had heard this variety of condescension in Bristol, counting houses and London trading floors, and every room where a man with a title had decided that a woman with a ledger was an entertainment rather than a participant, and she had developed a response so precise it could have been filed as a legal instrument. She was drawing breath to deliver it when the Duke spoke. He spoke from her right, which meant he had been closer than she had tracked, which meant he had been listening, which meant he had positioned himself within range before Sir Marcus began. A piece of tactical information she was going to examine very carefully later. The Harmouth Harbor assessment, the Duke said, and his voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It had Thornfield in it, 200 years of Devonshire stone and Atlantic weather, and the authority of a man whose family had been county before the county had been named. Was conducted jointly by my engineers and by Miss Ashford's. The assessment identified structural failures in the eastern breakwater that have been present for 3 years and were missed by every survey previously commissioned by, he paused, county families with established roots. He looked at Sir Marcus with the full, undivided attention she recognized from the study, the complete inventory, except this time directed at someone else, and the effect of it was comprehensive. Miss Ashford's corrections to the silting projections will save the Harmouth project an estimated £1,100 and prevent a second collapse within 5 years. I have reviewed her work. It is exceptional. He paused. By any standard, including the ones you are attempting to apply. Of course, Sir Marcus said. I merely intended. The harbor, the Duke said, is in better hands than it has been in a decade. I say this as the man competing against those hands for the contract. I would appreciate it if the county extended them the same professional respect I do. He turned back to his conversation. Sir Marcus found someone across the room who needed speaking to urgently. The space where the confrontation had been closed itself with the seamless efficiency of a county that had witnessed a correction and was already incorporating it into the record. Alawan stood in the aftermath and breathed. She breathed and thought about what had just happened with the precision she brought to every important calculation. The Duke of Thornfield, her competitor, the man who had refused to take her hand, the man who had told her he did not negotiate with women, had just told a room full of Devonshire society that her work was exceptional. Had told them while competing against her. Had told them in the voice that carried 200 years of county authority, deployed not to protect his position, but to protect hers. She crossed the room to Lady Eva, who was standing by the fireplace with a glass of wine, and the expression of a woman watching a prediction arrive precisely on schedule. He defended me, Alawan said. He is my competitor, actively bidding against me for the contract that will define this county's commerce for 20 years. And he defended my work to a room that needed to hear it. Why? Because he could not allow inaccurate information to stand in a room where he was present. It is his finest quality, and his most inconvenient one. Lady Eva took a sip of wine. And because he has spent 3 months discovering that the woman he declined to negotiate with is the most capable person in this county, and the discovery has been, she selected the word, clarifying. Clarifying, Alawan repeated. He sees you now, Lady Eva said. He has seen you since the harbor, possibly before. The assessment did not create the seeing. It removed his last excuse for pretending he was not. She paused. And the way he said it, did you notice? He made it about the work, about the engineering, about the harbor, so that Sir Marcus had no graceful way to continue, so that the room understood the correction without requiring Soren to make a declaration, and so that you were defended without being diminished. She set down her glass. That is a very specific kind of intelligence, and he does not deploy it often. Alawan held her wine and thought about 3 months of harbor surveys and joint assessments and November afternoons on a breakwater in the rain. She thought about a man who had told her to negotiate through her father and had just spent his own credibility telling a county that she was exceptional, and the distance between those two things, and what it had taken him to cross it. He was wrong about me, she said, in September. Yes, Lady Eva said, and he has known it for some time. He is a man who does his accounting carefully. He required sufficient evidence before revising the ledger. She looked at her nephew across the room. The evidence is now comprehensive. Alawan looked across the room at the Duke, who at that precise moment looked back. 1 second of complete, undefended attention, the kind that did not inventory, but simply acknowledged, the way a compass acknowledged north. And then he returned to his conversation, and she returned to hers, and neither of them needed to say anything further. Dunmore found her at the end of the evening. He defended your work at the expense of his own competitive position. The room now associates your competence with his endorsement, which strengthens our bid and weakens his. I am aware of the strategic implications, Alawan said. Dunmore looked at her with the unhurried gaze that preceded his most considered statements. I don't think he was considering the strategic implications, he said quietly. I think he was considering you." He came to the Harmouth office on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after the assembly. He came on foot, which she noted, because the Duke of Thornfield did not walk to places, and a man who arrived on foot had chosen a mode of arrival that did not announce itself. He wanted a conversation, not an occasion. She was at the desk reviewing timber contracts when her clerk appeared at the door. "The Duke of Thornfield, Miss Ashford. He's asking whether you might receive him." "Show him in." He entered without the architecture of authority he carried in formal rooms. He was wearing the practical coat from the harbor wall, and she noticed this the way she noticed everything about this man, completely, and with increasing difficulty in pretending she did not. He looked at the office, the desk covered in contracts and harbor surveys, the correspondence she had been managing for 3 months. He looked at all of it the way a man reads a room when he wants to understand the person who occupies it. "You work here," he said, "every morning." "Not a drawing room. Here, on the harbor." "The harbor is where the work is. I find it inefficient to work at a distance from the thing I am working on." He was quiet. He was standing inside the door, not yet seated, and the distance between them was the length of the office and also the length of everything since September. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited. "In the study. In September. What I said, the manner of it, wasn't a principle. I called it a principle. I presented it as proper order. It wasn't." "What was it?" she said. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she could hear the harbor through the window, the workmen on the staging, the tide against the breakwater, the ordinary machinery of a place being rebuilt. "My mother," he said, "managed Thornfield for 11 years after my father died. She managed it brilliantly. The tenants, the accounts, the county relationships, everything. And she was never once consulted by the solicitors, or the bankers, or the estate trustees. They wrote to my uncle. They wrote to the family steward. When I came of age at 21, they wrote to me. A boy who knew nothing. They never wrote to her." He looked at the desk. She never complained. She considered it the natural order. She managed an estate worth £40,000 a year and considered herself an assistant to men who could not have managed a Tuesday without her guidance. "And you concluded," Elowen said slowly, "that the natural order was correct, because she accepted it. I concluded something I had no evidence for, and considerable evidence against, and I held it as policy because it was easier than examining it, and I am here because I cannot hold it any longer." She looked at the man standing in her office, naming the origin of a prejudice he had carried like inherited furniture. Never chosen, never examined, simply present because it had always been present, and dismantling it in front of her with a courage that made being honest more important than being comfortable. "You refused my hand," she said. "Yes." "I have thought about that hand," he said, "every day since. What it meant that you offered it. What it meant that I refused. What it cost me, not the Harmouth bid, not the competitive position. What it cost me in the only currency I have discovered I cannot replenish. What currency is that? Your respect, which I forfeited in the first 30 seconds of our acquaintance, and have been attempting to earn back through harbor walls and assembly speeches and a joint assessment I signed because it was accurate, and because writing my name beside yours was the closest I could come to the handshake, I refused." "Sit down," she said. He sat in the working chair across her desk, and she poured tea and handed him the cup and looked at him. "I did not take Dunmore's hand because of Dunmore," she said. He was still. "I took it because you refused mine. I wanted you to see what it looked like when a man who was your equal treated me as a negotiating partner rather than an inconvenience. I wanted it to cost you something. I told myself it was strategy. And it was. And it was also the most personal thing I have ever done in a professional context. He set down his cup. I reviewed your filing with the Harbor Commission. I did not need to. I have no oversight role. I obtained it through channels that were technically available and practically irregular. And I read it at Thornfield at 11 o'clock at night. And your projections were more precise than anything my engineers had produced. And I sat in the study, where I had refused your hand, and read the proof that refusing it was the single greatest error of judgment I have made in a decade. She looked at him. You read my Harbor filing at 11 o'clock at night. I have read everything you have filed since September, every survey, every contract amendment. It has all been exceptional, and I have been conducting an audit of my own position, and the audit is complete, and the results are not in my favor. The glove, she said. He waited. She opened the desk drawer. She took out the right glove, the one from September, the amber one, the one she had placed on his desk and retrieved when he would not take what it offered. She had kept it in this drawer since October. She placed it on the desk between them. I kept it, she said. The glove I was wearing when you refused my hand. I put it in this desk the day I moved into this office, and I have looked at it approximately once a week since. I told myself it was a reminder of the insult, and it was also a reminder that I had offered something genuine to someone I had judged worth offering it to, and that judgment has been, she met his eyes, despite considerable effort to revise it, correct. He looked at the glove on the desk. He looked at it the way he had looked at the Harbor wall, assessing what could hold weight and what could not. Then he reached across the desk and picked it up and held it and looked at her over it. May I? He said. What I should have done in September. She removed her right glove, the one she was wearing now, the winter one, and placed it beside its September counterpart, and extended her bare hand across the surface, exactly as she had done 3 months ago, except that everything was different. The room, the season, the woman, the man, and everything was exactly the same, because the gesture had always meant this, an offer of equality and a test of willingness. The only thing that had changed was the answer. He took her hand. Look, his grip was warm and firm and unhesitating, and he held it for longer than a handshake and shorter than a declaration, and exactly long enough to mean everything neither of them had said since September, compressed into the pressure of a palm against a palm. Miss Ashford, he said, and his voice had dropped below every register she had catalogued, the study voice, the Harbor voice, the assembly voice, into one she had not heard before, one that had nothing of title or position in it, just the sound of a man saying a name he had been thinking about for 3 months. Elowen, she said, if we are going to do this, you will use my name. Elowen, he said, and the sound of it in his voice with the Harbor outside and the 2 gloves on the desk was something she would remember with absolute precision for a very long time. Soren, she said, because she had learned his name in September and had never used it and had been saving it for exactly this moment. He kissed her. He came around the desk with purpose and kissed her with the thoroughness of a man who had spent 3 months reading her Harbor filings at 11 o'clock at night and had arrived at a conclusion he was no longer willing to express through co-signed assessments. She kissed him back with the precision she brought to contracts and every true calculation she had ever made, and the 2 gloves lay on the desk like a before and after, and neither of them required any further negotiation. When they separated, she kept her hand on his arm. The Harmouth contract, she said, is going to be complicated. I am asking whether it is going to be more complicated now. I'm going to propose something to the Commission, he said. A joint bid, Thornfield and Ashford Dunmore, combined resources, shared oversight. The harbor is too large for either bid alone. The storm proved that. A joint venture resolves the infrastructure question and the capital question, and the fact that competing against you is no longer something I am able to do with any conviction. You are proposing to merge your bid with your rivals. I am proposing to negotiate with you, which is what I should have done in September. I accept, she said, on the condition that the terms are negotiated between us, not through stewards, not through solicitors, between us, directly in this office. I would not have it any other way, he said, and the corner of his mouth did something she had not seen before. The real smile, the unmanaged one, belonging to a man who had just surrendered a position with more relief than regret. Dunmore received the news with strategic composure. Elowen told him in person, at Dunmore Hall, everything, because he had been her partner and had earned the truth rather than a version of it. He listened, and when she finished, he said, "The joint bid is sound. The harbor needs both positions." "And the rest of it?" she said. The look was steady and clear, holding the grace of a man releasing something he had been holding lightly enough to release well. "The rest of it was always going to resolve this way. I have known since the assembly, possibly since the harbor." He paused. "A man does not defend a competitor's work in a public room because he values correct information. He does it because he values the person who produced it. I recognize the distinction. I chose not to mention it until it became relevant." He extended his hand. "Partners. In the Harmouth bid. The other partnership was always going to be a shorter contract." She took his hand, the firm, brief grip of a woman who understood what she was being given, an ending that honored the beginning, and she was grateful, and she told him so, and he received it with composure, having decided that losing with clarity was preferable to winning with ambiguity. The engagement was settled by the end of January. Soren asked in the Harmouth office, where the gloves still sat in the desk drawer, and he asked by saying, "I find that I am unable to construct a version of my future that does not have you in this office, arguing with me about silting projections, and I would like to formalize that arrangement." She had said, "That is the least romantic proposal in the history of Devonshire," and he had said, "I am aware. I am also aware that you prefer accuracy to romance, and the accurate version is that I want to marry you because you are the only person who has ever made me revise a position I held for 30 years, and I consider that worth a formal commitment." Her father received the news in the Bristol office. "The Duke of Thornfield," he said, without looking up from the ledger. "The man who does not negotiate with women. He has revised that position." Her father looked up with the attention of a man who had spent 24 years watching this person become the most capable individual he had ever encountered, and who had spent 4 months watching her fall in love while pretending to conduct a harbor dispute. "Is he good enough for you?" he said. She thought about it. She thought about September, and the study, and the hand he had refused, and October, and the harbor she had claimed, and November, and the storm, and his hand on her arm on the broken staging, and December, and the assembly, and the office, and the gloves on the desk, and his name in her voice, and her name in his. "He is becoming good enough," she said, which is the honest answer. "It is the best answer," her father said. "Any man who is already good enough has not been tested. A man who is becoming good enough is paying attention." He wrote to the Duke that evening. The letter contained the Ashford terms, the fortune, the shipping interests, the harbor stake, stated without apology or ornament, the way Harlan Ashford stated everything. Soren's reply arrived the following morning, addressed to Elowen. It said, "Your father's terms are generous and entirely secondary. I am marrying the woman who corrected my silting projections and my character in the same season. The accounts are incidental. S. She read it twice and put it in the desk drawer with the 2 gloves. There were 14 letters in that drawer now. She closed it with the careful attention of a woman cataloging something she intended to keep. Lady Iva hosted the engagement dinner at Fenworth House on the first Friday of March. 44 people. The full county. The tables arranged with the geometric precision of a woman who understood that seating was a form of rhetoric and intended this evening to be eloquent. Elowen sat at Soren's right. She wore deep amber again. Not the same dress. A better one. The one her father had sent from London. She wore her mother's earrings, simple and correct, and the right choice for an evening that was already communicating more than any accessory needed to add. Soren looked at her over his wineglass with the full, unguarded attention she was now permitted to acknowledge. "Are you prepared for 44 people's opinions about our engagement?" "I've been managing rooms since I was 16, she said. "I am prepared." "I know," he said. "I am asking for my benefit, not yours." She looked at him. He was surveying the table with the practiced attention of a man who had been hosting since he was 20. But the remark was for her, and they both knew it. "The correct standard," she said quietly, "is considerably above fine, and you have been meeting it for some time." Sir Marcus Welling was present, 4 seats down, included, and expected to behave accordingly. He congratulated them at the end of the evening with mechanical grace. Elowen received it with composed directness, and nothing further was required. Dunmore was present. He arrived alone, which the county noted. He was seated across from Elowen. Lady Evok's arrangement, because the most interesting story at this table was not the engagement, but the triangle that had preceded it, and placing Dunmore in Elowen's sightline was a way of letting the room see that all 3 parties had resolved the situation with a grace the county could study and learn from. Dunmore raised his glass during the toast and met Elowen's eyes, the steady, clear look that held the loss lightly and the respect completely. And she met it back, and the room saw this and understood, and the understanding added something to the evening that Lady Ivok had not arranged but would later take credit for. They were married in April at the church in Harmouth that overlooked the harbor. The harbor was visible through the east window, the new staging rising, the breakwater being rebuilt. A project that had begun as a weapon and become something that belonged to both of them. Thornfield Stone and Ashford Capital, and the corrections of someone who had been right about the silting, and right about the man, and right about everything except the timeline. She wore amber. Soren had not been surprised. Her father had simply nodded. She reached the front of the church. Soren looked at her with an expression that had nothing of September in it, nothing of the study, nothing of the inventory, nothing of the man who had placed his hands flat on a desk and told her he did not negotiate with women. Just him. Looking at the woman who had removed her glove and offered her hand, and, when he refused it, had taken his rival's hand instead, and made him watch while she rebuilt a harbor and his assumptions simultaneously. She removed her right glove. She did it slowly, deliberately, in the church, in front of 44 people, and the harbor through the east window and the county that had been watching since September. Finger by finger, with the same calm precision she had used in his study. And then she extended her bare hand, not across a desk, in a church in April in the Devonshire light, with her father behind her, and Lady Eva in the second row, and Dunmore in the fourth, and the entire county holding its breath. He took her hand, without hesitation, without the 3-second pause of September. He took it with the warm, unhesitating grip of a man who understood that this time it was not a handshake at all, but a promise. The gesture that had begun in September as a test, "I see you as an equal, do you see me?" completed itself in April as an answer. "I see you. I was the last to admit it, and the most changed by the admission, and I am not letting go. Alawen, he said. Soren, she said. They didn't let go. The reception was at Thornfield Manor. Alawen moved through it with the ease of a woman on her own ground, which it was not yet technically, but would be by evening, and was already in every way that mattered. She spoke with Dunmore, who found her by the east window in the late afternoon. He looked at the harbor visible in the distance. The key staging is ahead of schedule, he said. By 2 weeks. Your projections? He asked. My projections. He looked at her with the steady gaze that had always seen her clearly, from the first meeting in his study, with the chair moved beside the desk. He is fortunate, Dunmore said. He is becoming aware of it, she said. I am ensuring the awareness is thorough. She spoke with her father, who found her at the edge of the room as the afternoon light moved across the Devonshire countryside. Well, he said. She looked at Soren across the room, managing the reception with a quality she had not seen at any previous occasion, a lightness, small but real, like a ship that had finally found the current it was built for. He is happy, she said. Are you? She thought about it with the honesty it deserved. I am, she said. I am also still annoyed about 2 things he said during the harbor assessment, and I intend to revisit them when the moment is appropriate. Her father looked at her. You are going to be a magnificent Duchess. I know, she said. I have planned for it. He laughed, the full, genuine laugh of a man who had spent a lifetime being proud of this person and had decided today was the correct occasion to let it show completely. Soren found her in the east garden as the April light lengthened across the Thornfield grounds. She was looking at the harbor on the horizon, the staging rising, and she was calculating something. He could tell by her stillness. All of it, he said. The house, the estate, the harbor, the dining room you are going to reorganize. All of it is yours. And I want you to know that I know the reason it will work is not my name on the deed, but your hand on the wheel. She looked at the man who had told her he did not negotiate with women and was now telling her everything he had was hers to manage. And she thought about what it meant to hear that from someone who had spent 30 years believing the opposite, and had revised the belief not because she had argued him out of it, but because she had made the argument unnecessary by simply being undeniable. Soren, she said, I'm going to negotiate the terms of this marriage, and you are going to negotiate them with me, not with my father, not with solicitors, with me, directly, in every room, on every question, for the rest of it. He looked at her, with nothing of September left in his expression. Just him, looking at the woman who had taken his rival's hand and rebuilt his harbor and corrected his projections and his character, and had chosen him anyway. I do not negotiate with women, he said, and the words were the same words from September, and the voice was entirely different. A man quoting the most expensive sentence he had ever spoken, and finding in the repetition not the principle he had believed in, but the absurdity he had graduated from. She looked at him. He looked at her. And the sentence that had begun the story ended it, turned completely inside out by 7 months of harbor walls and storm-broken staging, and a glove removed in a church, and a hand, finally taken. You do now, she said. He took her hand. The bare one. The one that had started everything. The April evening went on around them, warm and unhurried, and entirely indifferent to whether any of it had been strategic, and the answer they had both arrived at was that it had been, just not in the way she had told herself in September. The best negotiations, her father had always said, were the ones where both parties left holding something they hadn't known they wanted. She looked at the man holding her hand in the garden of the house that was now hers, and understood the negotiation completely.